Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to the 8 Intertwined Retrospective. I'm Crescent, otherwise known as Digital Dreams, and I'm the author of the Octopath Traveler novelization 8 Intertwined. The story came to an end recently, about 2 months ago, with the release of its final chapter, and I thought I would come here and tell everyone a few details about the story. Well, maybe it's more than a few because this retrospective is 16,000 words long, but I've got a lot to say. Eight Intertwined has been in development for almost 4 years, and I'm very proud of it. This story has been such a massive part of my life for so long, and I feel like this is the best way to send it off and get ready for my next era. So, before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about this retrospective. So, first off, I am recording this all in one take, just as a nice, casual, laid back thing, so sorry if I trip over my words at any point. As for the structure of this retrospective, I'm going to start off by talking about the origin story of Eight Intertwined before going into general story details. After that, I have sections set aside for each of the 8 main characters to discuss the ways I write them, how their story changed, and why I settled on the choices I made. And then lastly, we'll dive into discussions of the new postgame chapter, Journey's End, and then wrap everything up. This is going to be very long and in-depth, so this is your last warning for spoilers, because I'll be talking about everything in the novelization here from beginning to end. If you haven't read it yet, go read it, and then come back when you're done. You'll get a lot more mileage out of this that way. So with all that out of the way, let's get right into things. So I think the best place to start when talking about Eight Intertwined is the beginning, or more specifically, where the story came from. Eight Intertwined has an admittedly long and complicated history that led up to its creation and publication. For the sake of honesty, I want to talk about that here since no one has ever heard this story before. In March of 2020, I was a junior in high school. The pandemic forced my school to close for the rest of the semester, and I was later a virtual student all throughout my senior year. In other words, I was in my house doing virtual school from March 2020 to May 2021. When the pandemic first hit, I was experiencing something of a resurgence in one of my oldest interests, Digimon. I spent all my time thinking about Digimon, and eventually it led me to the 4th season, Digimon Frontier. I loved Frontier as a kid, but when I got older, I started to see some of the flaws with it. That led to me digging into rewrites online, something that I'd gotten into a few years prior because of my childhood love of Winx Club, which was another show that I really liked. When I looked into it, I found that no one had done a rewrite of Digimon Frontier, so I took it upon myself. Originally, it was just a series of outlines, but I wound up falling in love with my versions of the characters, and I decided to write the project out in full. That story would come to be known as Frontiers Unexplored, the first part of the Horizon Wars trilogy. Frontiers Unexplored was my lifeline throughout the pandemic. I started writing it in May of 2020 and finished it in January 2021. The full story was around 600,000 words, and I wrote it in its entirety in 8 months. My senior year of high school was one of the roughest times of my life because of the nature of being a virtual student. My school offered options for being in person or virtual, and since I'm disabled and live with someone immunocompromised, I decided to stay home. It was overwhelmingly lonely. All of my friends at school pretty much forgot about me, and they were making memories without me. You never realize how much it hurts to be forgotten until you end up in that position. Frontiers Unexplored was my reprieve from all of that. They say that you should write what you know, but when working on Frontiers Unexplored, I wrote for what I wanted. I wanted to be with my friends and to just feel like I could connect to people again. Since I was essentially teaching myself through my final year of regular schooling, I was lonely and wanted to be with others. Frontiers Unexplored is a very character-driven story about overcoming hardship through connections with others, and it's no wonder that story was my reason for being for so long. By the time Frontiers Unexplored finished being written in January 2021, I was in love with it and didn't know what to do without it. Frontiers Unexplored was my everything, and at the time, I hadn't thought about a sequel. I didn't know how I was supposed to go on without the story there to guide me. A sequel would later release in 2022 as Fates Unbound, but this was over a year before that. Around this time, 3 perfect storm factors came together to create Eight Intertwined. The first was Frontiers Unexplored itself. My writing was already something I was very proud of before Frontiers Unexplored, but it remains one of my favorite stories because, out of everything I've ever written, because of how it elevated my craft. I learned so much about character building, fight sequences, and plot progression from Frontiers Unexplored. Eight Intertwined would not exist in its current form without Frontiers Unexplored coming first and teaching me how to tell a story like this while refining my writing style in every way. The second factor was a resurgence in my Octopath interest that happened in January 2021 during the massive snowstorm that hit the Midwest. I was locked in my house for 3 days with one of the very few friends I maintained through high school, and we played Octopath for 12 hours in those days. I remembered how much I loved it, and I wanted to write something for it, but I didn't know what. In the end, my decision was made from the third factor of the trio, a novelization of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance known as Metal and Flame. The story has been on hiatus for a long time, but I adore it, and it was what encouraged me to take up novelizations of existing content as an art form. Between Frontiers Unexplored starting and ending, a spike in interest in Octopath, and falling in love with Metal and Flame, 8 Intertwined was born. And to be perfectly honest, I did not expect 8 Intertwined to make it this far. At the time, I was looking for any reprieve from life I could find. Frontiers Unexplored finished being published in May of 2021, but I finished writing it on January 28th, 2021. It's no coincidence that just over 2 weeks later, 8 Intertwined was released on February 13th, 2021. In many ways, Frontiers Unexplored was 8 Intertwined was rebound writing to cope with the end of Frontiers Unexplored. Got mixed up for a second there. Once again, I was writing for what I wanted. The emphasis on interactions between the travelers is not just something I added because of the medium. It was the entire appeal, especially to a lonely high schooler on the cusp of graduation who was going on a year without seeing their friends' faces. By the time I saw all of my old friends again, we had grown into such different people that our friendships didn't even feel recognizable. That was why I fell so hard into 8 Intertwined, and it was the same reason that Frontiers Unexplored was written before that. I wanted human connection, and when I couldn't find it, I made it for myself. So that's how 8 Intertwined was created. I fell more and more in love with it the more I wrote it. Octopath has always been important to me, and I've been in love with this game ever since it was first announced. I adore it, and I always will. It felt like the perfect choice for a story to pull from to handle the tail end of my isolation, and even now, it's always going to be known as one of the stories that saved me when no one else came to my rescue. It sounds sappy as all hell, especially since this is a fanfiction we're talking about, but 8 Intertwined is everything to me. I give it my all because it gave me its all when I needed it most as a lonely 18-year-old. Water breaks are important, everyone. When it comes to general changes in 8 Intertwined, I think the most obvious is the godly shrines. In the game, it makes sense that you would walk up to a shrine, examine the altar, and get a subclass from it. In the novelization, that doesn't hold as much weight. In the end, I decided to go the route of the 4 secret classes and give every shrine a fight. Each battle shows off what the god and their respective class can do, and they act as a checkpoint for the traveler's progress both in combat and character. As I said before, this story pulls a lot of inspiration from Frontiers Unexplored, which is another story of mine. Perhaps the greatest example of that is character-driven fight scenes. I think that a good fight scene can tell you a lot more about a character than just the way they fight. Their fighting style will inform their emotional state and mindset. For example, Therion tends to attack people where they are weak because that's what he does in his heists, too. He's not inclined to combat, but he knows how to make it hurt when he does fight. Primrose, meanwhile, goes in for the kill because that's what she's been trained to do. Old Burrick and Honnet both have an aura of honor about the way they fight, and Ophelia and Cyrus prefer to subdue their foes non-lethally. Alphen tends to stay on support, and Tressa is reckless and rushes in to show her youthful courage and naivete. The ways the characters fight tell a lot more about them than it seems at a first glance, and the god fights are perfect examples of that. The god fights are meant to show where the characters are, both on an individual level and where they are as a team. The travelers steadily get stronger throughout the chapter 2s and 3s, and they can start to hold their own in the face of the increasing strength of the gods. Their teamwork fluctuates depending on how they're all feeling at the time. For example, let's look at the fights against Balagar and Windhild. Those are the 2 last fights of the bunch, and they're very different. Balagar is an uphill battle against a strong opponent, but the travelers struggle because of their recent emotional issues. They cannot fight well as a unit because they are having a hard time opening up to each other and seeking the help they need. Balagar calls them out on this, and it spurs a lot of their development in the Wellspring arc. After the Wellspring arc, the group fights Windhild, and this uphill battle goes far better because the travelers are in harmony again. These fights happen at similar points in the story, but they tell us everything we need to know about the group's mindsets at the time. Speaking of the gods, the prologue was something I added in because I wanted to have a strong base to work with in terms of world building. I emphasize in the opening note that this story is only canon to itself because all of my ideas were proven very gracelessly non-canon by champions of the continent. The game came out in English after I had already been working on this story for a year and a half, and at that point, I'm not changing it. My lore for the gods is also inconsistent with the Japanese exclusive tabletop RPG of all things, if you can believe it, since they have information about the gods in the guidebook. Unfortunately, the guidebook has not been officially translated anywhere, and I learned that from a friend who has not actively started working on a full translation yet, so you're just gonna have to trust me on that. The extra elements in the godly weapons were a bit of self-indulgence on my part. If you want me to be honest, it came from Frontiers Unexplored. Get used to hearing that if you haven't already. Those are the 12 elements in Frontiers Unexplored, and at one point, those were the 12 weapons associated with the legendary warriors in that story's sequel. The weapons detail was eventually scrapped, but the elements stuck around. Even Galdera's element, the Power of Souls, was consistent with the 13th character that I had plans of canonizing Two Frontiers Unexplored at the time of 8 Intertwined's release, but I did in the sequel later on. So if you've ever wondered where all those extra elements came from, it was Frontiers Unexplored, and with me, it feels like it always is. On a completely different note, let's talk about the story structure. I was originally planning on having every in-game chapter from 1 to 4 all be 4 chapters of content in 8 Intertwined. And yeah, that didn't happen. I'm glad I didn't try to stick to it, though. I feel like the slower pace is something only this novelization can do, and it works to expertly develop all of the characters. I planned for this story very little and just kind of tucked details away in my head to think about it later. I let my pen take me wherever it wanted to, and it wanted to slow down in the chapter 2s and 3s. Even the chapter 4s only happen as fast as they do because I knew that Journey's End was going to follow them. I really like how the pacing turned out, even if it's different from the game. But being different from the game is kind of the point of the story, isn't it? When it came to figuring out the story order, I knew I wanted to go in Octopath order to pick up the characters, and after that, I just went with what was most logical for the character arcs. It took me a while to figure out something I liked, but I ran with it once I had it all settled down. I tried to space out the different chapters of the characters so no one character hogged the spotlight for too long. The sole exception to that was Ophelia having the last chapter 3 and the first chapter 4 for pretty obvious plot reasons. I also went with what I thought would be best for the character arcs, and it was a lot to consider, but I really love how it all turned out. I definitely took different approaches to each chapter of in-game content. All of the chapter 1s are introductory. The chapter 2s are the real meat of the story, and I gave them a lot more than the base game because of the nature of this medium. The chapter 3s are a natural step up from the chapter 2s, raising the stakes and putting the pressure on the group leading into Wellspring and Goldshore. The chapter 4s are there to wrap up the character arcs while still leaving room for everyone to grow. I'll talk more about Journey's End at the end of the character sections, but the 4 basic chapters felt like a decent enough outline to follow. I just needed to figure out what to do with them, and I'm very happy with how everything came together. The last thing I want to talk about in this general story section is the cohesions of the towns. There are 8 towns that have multiple chapters in the chapter 2s and 3s, but the 2 chapters don't really rely on each other much because of the open structure of Octopath. It's hard to have 2 chapters lean on one another when that could potentially cause plot holes if certain characters hadn't been picked up already. Since I didn't need to worry about that though, I decided to use the chapters that took place in the same town to flesh out the environment. That's a crucial part of world building, and it really helps to make the towns feel alive in a way they may not have in the base game. There's not just necromancy happening in the same town that Tressa overthrows a corrupt landlord. One event fuels another. Morlock's apathy and neglect led to Gideon's necromancy. Similarly, the Lizardman uprising blocks the black market from starting on time in Wellspring. It helps to create a sense of cohesion while expanding on the universe around the travelers. Quick water break, and then we go on. And speaking of the travelers, I wanted to dedicate sections of this retrospective to discussing each of the characters in detail. I did a lot with them over the course of this story, and I think they vary enough from their canon counterparts to merit discussion. Plus, I just love rambling about them. Everybody wins. Ophelia is a character who is defined by her faith. I'm not just talking about her religion either. Sure, her faith in the teachings of the Sacred Flame is important to her, but there's more to it than that. Ophelia has faith in people. She is defined by an unwavering belief that the world is good and that it can be made into a greater place with effort and love. Liana taught her that there was still hope after her parents passed away, and Ophelia has kept those teachings close to her heart ever since then. Ophelia's faith is a beautiful aspect of her character, but I think it's also one of her greatest flaws. The first major divergence from canon in this entire story is when Ophelia leaves Flamesgrace. She's convinced that Joseph will be alright, and is sure that he's wrong when he says that he's dying. She's confident that he will still be alive when she returns to Flamesgrace. This massively comes back to bite her at the end of the story when she realizes she was wrong. Ophelia was convinced that Joseph would survive because she had faith that he would endure. In this case, her faith hurt her and kept her from seeing the dark realities of the situation at hand. It puts her in perfect contrast with Matthias, another character who believed faith would be enough to overcome tragedy. Where Ophelia diverges from Matthias, though, is that she continues to have hope even after realizing the darkness of the world. Even after Joseph passes and Liana betrays her, Ophelia believes the world is a good place and that it is worth saving. It is this undying belief that ties the travelers together as a group. Ophelia is a force for good in all senses of the word. She thinks the world is a good place and that people deserve to see the light of hope. She is powerful because she continues to have hope. Her faith is her greatest blessing, and while it is her flaw as well, it is the fact that she endures in the face of that knowledge that makes her a good leader. I consider this story as having an ensemble cast, but if you had to twist my arm, I would say that Ophelia is the protagonist. She's the binding force of endless love and a desire for progress that keeps the group held together. She's the reason Therion is there at all. She keeps everyone from falling apart, and when she stumbles, the others are all there for her in return. Ophelia has seen the horrors of the world firsthand, and she witnesses even more throughout the story, but she always gets back up again. That is what makes her truly Ophelia in my eyes. She never gives up, and it's as inspiring as it is important. As the main character, Ophelia is really at the heart of every conflict of character and interest in this story. Her breakdown in Quarry Crest truly marks a turning point for the arc and the rest of the story as a whole. She's running around and putting out fires during the betrayal string in the middle of the chapter 3s. Ophelia snaps in Goldshore, but it shows the health of the group as a whole because they're all there to steady her. They were falling apart previously, but I have found the strength to rise again because of her. Ophelia is a cleric in class, but her healing goes beyond simple magic or physical wounds. She is an emotional healer too, and without her the travelers would not be anywhere near as strong as they are now. Ophelia is far from the strongest physically, but she is a pillar of power emotionally, and the entire group follows her lead in times light and dark. I think this also shows in the fact that Ophelia connects with so many NPCs. She forms close bonds with Bartolo and the children from her chapters 2 and 3. Ophelia has a simply calming aura that pulls others closer, and that gravitational pull is enough to bind the entire travelers group together. Even so, it's never by force. She gives Alfin the option to leave in Wellspring, but he chooses to stay. She encourages Therion, but does not force him into anything, and in the end he chooses to have faith in the rest of the group. Ophelia's belief in people reinforces their belief in her. Ophelia's journey is defined as being one of light, and in my eyes it goes much deeper than simply the kindling. Ophelia herself is light, and she brings light to the lives of those around her simply by being there. Her faith may be a notable weakness for her, but it is also the reason that she is able to keep standing up again. She leads through her belief in people, and it's exactly what makes her such an effective leader and binding force for the travelers and the story as a whole. When it comes to writing Cyrus, I know I made a few unorthodox choices around his character development. Cyrus is my favorite character in the game, and I had a lot of fun playing with him as my leading travelers. But I also acknowledge that there are flaws in his writing. Cyrus is a strange case out of the Travelers, since between the start and end of his story, he doesn't really change much as a person. He's already pretty much figured himself out by the time the story begins, and he doesn't have much of a reason to change that. In the game, Cyrus begins the story passionate about his belief in knowledge and his desire to teach others. By the end of his story, he has reconfirmed his resolve, but he doesn't really change all that much as a result of Gideon, Yvonne, or Lucia's machinations. I don't mean for this to be a knock against Cyrus or anything. He's my favorite character in the game, and I thoroughly enjoy him. Still, I knew that if I kept things the same as the game with his development, then he was going to end up feeling awfully flat when compared to the rest of the travelers. In a story about growth in relationships, I needed to give Cyrus a bit more pronounced of an arc. Enter his fear of blood. Contrary to what one might expect, Cyrus here is somewhat sheltered. He knows the world well through his books, but he hasn't ever ventured out into it until the story starts. His story deals with some pretty gruesome events, and here his response to it is much stronger than in the game. In the game, Cyrus approaches the situation rationally and calmly, and he handles the trials that come his way very well. Unfortunately, he doesn't have much of an arc around it, so I had to take a different approach. Cyrus having a fear of blood here was something I decided on a whim, and the more I thought about it, the more it stuck. It gave him a much weightier reaction to everything he finds in Quarry Crest, and it drives him forward while rattling him to the core. Cyrus fumbles a bit in his confidence here, and it takes him time to get back on his feet again after seeing all the horrors he does early in his story. His trauma and response to all he witnesses gives him a new internal conflict to work through. In the end, he still finishes at the same spot as in the game. He declares his belief in the power of knowledge and his desire to see it passed down to generations to come. Cyrus's journey is getting there, and getting there is just a bit different, and it gives him a more tangible arc than the game. The other thing I loved with writing Cyrus was his revelations about the overarching story. I wanted him to start to put the pieces together as the journey grew longer, and he most certainly did so. It was a bit of a challenge to balance what we know as players of the game versus what the travelers would know at the present moment, but I think I handled it well. Cyrus starts to figure things out early enough to realize something is wrong, and it works into his favor by giving him a lot more to consider in the later stages of the story. Since Cyrus is so in tune with the overarching story, it puts him in an unfortunate situation of having to break difficult truths to the other travelers. This is best seen with him talking to Primrose about Simeon's immortality or revealing that Joseph's death was a murder to Ophelia. Cyrus feels a sense of responsibility over his traveling companions, and that responsibility keeps him from thinking straight at times. He wants to be able to protect them, and when he realizes he cannot, he struggles. Cyrus struggles to communicate his emotions, something that made even harder by his trauma after his chapter 2, and it makes it harder for him to reach out and defend those he cares for. Part of Cyrus's arc is learning to recognize that he does not need to take responsibility for everything that happens. He can make mistakes and think irrationally just like everyone else, and he needs to balance his new influx of emotions and fear with the logical thinking that ruled him before the story. Cyrus is one of the most logical and analytical travelers, but he is prone to emotional outbursts just like anyone else, and it's central to his character here. Cyrus is definitely an experimental character in this story, but I love the way he turned out. His portrayal may be different from the game, but I think it works for the type of story 8 Intertwined is trying to tell. Cyrus has a lot more room to be involved with the overarching plot here, and it helps him to reconfirm his desire to teach and help those who need it. The time to breathe allows Cyrus to act as a vessel for an unaware reader to understand the story and all it entails, and I think it works to his favor as a character. I love water. Okay. Let's get the big one out of the way first. Tressa's second chapter and the Morlock changes. That was the one shift I came up with on a whim back when I was working on the earlier chapter 2s. I love the chapter 2s and all, but since they're the longest arc, I wanted to add something in to spice them up. I had a lot of ideas for how to change the chapter 3s and 4s to fit this medium, but the chapter 2s were a bit of a mystery. They kind of exist in a liminal space between the beginning and penultimate chapters, so they can be kind of hit or miss in terms of quality when compared to what comes before or after them. Tressa's chapter 2 was one I wound up targeting because I didn't really think much of it as a chapter on its own. It's fine in the game, but I wanted to give it a bit more substance here. In the end, the change happened because I got the Octopath guidebook. It was finally translated in English after being Japan exclusive for over 2 years, and when I read it, I learned about Creek. Well, learned is probably a strong word since it was mentioned once in the timeline at the end of the book, but I still wanted to do something with it. So after a bit of thinking, I decided to throw Creek in as an important plot point, and that's how we got the connection between Saintsbridge and Quarry Crest in the chapter 2s. I was so excited for this plot point after I planned it. I was biding my time waiting for the day when I could release the chapters about Morlock, and I wrote ahead as much as I could stand so that I could get everything out as soon as possible. I was always planning on having Ophelia kill Morlock to save Alphen, and it would later mirror Alphen having to kill Miguel to save Therion. Like I said, I had a lot I wanted to change in the chapter 3s and 4s, but the chapter 2s were a different story until this plot point came up, and I fell for it hard. Granted, it was declared non-canon by Champions of the Continent, but I don't care. I like it too much to care. And for a long time, it was my favorite part of the story. The Quarry Crest arc was my favorite, actually, until the Wellspring arc showed up much later on. I really love the changes I made to the Quarry Crest section, specifically Tressa's half of it. To date, it's one of my favorite parts of the story, even though the chapter 2s have probably been outshone by everything that came after them. Now that Morlock and Omar are out of the way, let's talk about Tressa herself. I've gotten a lot of compliments on my characterization of Tressa over the years, and I'm glad to hear that my version of her resonates with people. I wish I could tell you about the development I had in mind for her, but I really didn't have much in terms of premeditated plans. Tressa was one of the characters that came the easiest to me when writing out their dialogue. It took me a long time to get Oldburick, Therion, and Honnet to a place I was happy with, but Tressa I picked up immediately and had no problems with. I think her story as a whole is one that benefits most from this medium. I still think the number one person who benefits from this format is Therion, but Tressa's up there too. Her forming unbreakable bonds with the Travelers by the time of her chapter 4 really helps to make everything hit harder. The fact that her final chapter is the last one works in her favor too. I call her the quote-unquote thematic final traveler of Octopath 1. In other words, she's the character whose final chapter should come last because it feels like it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of what it means to be Octopath Traveler. I loved playing with her as the thematic final traveler, and her last chapter was the moment I was looking forward to most with her. But let's back up and talk about Tressa as a person a bit more. I definitely leaned hard into Tressa's insecurities near the beginning of the story, and made her anxious about combat at first. She picks it up quickly, but she's nowhere near as gung-ho as some of the other travelers. Until Quarry Crest, but that's not the point. We've been over that. She benefits massively from having the other travelers there to encourage her, and more importantly, to teach her. Tressa's story is a journey of learning and growth, and I figured out how and figuring out how to stand her ground and establish her sense of justice goes a long way there. With Tressa, I always had a good idea of where I wanted her to end up. Her story is the perfect place for the cast to finish their adventures, so I wanted Tressa to embody the spirit of Octopath itself. That's why her growth is so accentuated throughout the story. Ophelia might be the leading character, but Tressa is Octopath Traveler, and that's why I gave her such a focus in the epilogue. Since Tressa acts as the embodiment of Octopath in the story, I thought it was perfect for her to kickstart so many other characters' development. She spends a lot of the story learning and growing with the people around her because she's the youngest of the group. Still, she has valuable insight to offer, and I think her starting the treasures conversation is the perfect way to show that. Since this is a novelization, everybody gets focused in chapters that are not their own, and that leads to the question: what are everyone's greatest treasures? It's a crucial note for everyone's arcs, and it ties in very neatly with Tressa figuring out what she wants from life too. It's not just Tressa asking the others to consider their growth, it is Octopath itself asking them to reflect. Tressa is the spirit of adventure that binds the travelers together. Her story might not be as intense as the others, but it's still important as the glue that keeps the group as a team and a family. Tressa's story is crucial to everyone because of how it stresses how far they've come, and in turn teaches Tressa more about the world too. Since the epilogue is mostly about Tressa, I'm going to put a little bit of it here in her section. I admittedly got the idea for an epilogue from Octopath 2 since it came out while I was still trying to figure out what to do with the finale of this story. I had no idea how to wrap up everything after the Gate of Finis, but the presence of an epilogue in the sequel told me that I needed to do something like that here. Since Agnia is the thematic final traveler of Octopath 2, spoilers for Aid Interwoven, my Octopath 2 novelization, I guess, I wanted Tressa to take center stage here just like Agnia did in Octopath 2. Since I knew that Tressa was going to be at the heart of it all, I decided to make the finale something about her telling the story to others. I made a mental note to not have her give her journal to Noah in her chapter 4, but to instead wait until a later point, and that was going to be in the epilogue. But it wasn't going to just be about the journal. It would also be about Tressa telling the story to the rest of the world. Tressa is the spirit of Octopath, and so she's the vessel for the story too. I think this offered a new clarity to her character, and I loved building up to it throughout the chapter 3s and 4s. Overall, Tressa as a character was one of the easiest for me to lean into from the start. I loved her from beginning to end. I'm sorry I can't offer a better breakdown of what makes her character development so special in 8 Intertwined, but I feel like she gets something a bit better than that. Tressa just is Octopath Traveler to me, and that's what really drives her character throughout the story and the way I write her. Going into 8 Intertwined, Ulbrich was probably my least favorite of the 8 travelers. That's not to say I didn't like him, since I most certainly did, but I preferred all of the others. Over the course of 8 Intertwined, I would say that's one thing that changed a lot about me and my opinions. I may have thought of Ulbrich as my least favorite initially, but by the time I was finished, I no longer thought that. Now, I don't have a least favorite traveler, I just love all of them. With Ulbrich, I think he benefits most from the slower pace and introspection. By giving Ulbrich a bit more time to sit with his thoughts and decide on the kind of person he wants to be, it becomes a lot easier to understand him. I gained a massive appreciation for Ulbrich because I had the chance to get in his head and write for him. I understood the point of his journey well enough, but I feel like the written medium really helps to pin down why he feels so lost and aimless. It's a stark shift from a character like Tressa, who I was able to pick up and understand immediately. With Ulbrich, I took a long time to figure out how I liked writing him, and along the way, I learned from what works for him and what does not. Ulbrich was one of the characters I was most nervous about going into 8 Intertwined because I had less of an idea of how to handle him than the others. In terms of story, Ulbrich's tale doesn't change all that much. There aren't massive shifts like you find in Tressa's Chapter 2 or Cyrus's Chapter 3. Ulbrich's story is fairly loyal to the source material, but the extra time to breathe benefits him in a way that goes beyond the other travelers. Obviously, everyone can stand to benefit from this new medium and the ways in which they get to sit with their thoughts. With Ulbrich, his thoughts drive his entire story. It's not just Gaston and Gustav telling him where to find Erhardt that give him direction. Ulbrich wants closure, and that's a very internal pursuit, so his inner monologue is one of the most important aspects to his character when it comes to understanding him. The other major way that Ulbrich benefits from this retelling comes in the form of his Chapter 3. It's not necessarily a change, but the story gives him a lot more time to work out everything with Erhardt and then find inner peace before he moves on and leaves town. Ulbrich's Chapter 3 acts as the point where the Chapter 3 arc finally starts to look up. The group has been struggling since Stoneguard, but in Wellspring, things take a turn for the better because Ulbrich and Erhardt prove themselves as different from everything that lined the traveler's journey before this. Earhart betrayed Ulbrich in the past, but he is not going to continue to stab his old friend in the back. Their wounds are raw and painful, but they can still understand each other. When you compare that to the irreconcilable differences between people like Yvonne and Cyrus, or Alphen and Miguel, Earhart is a refreshing change of pace. Ulbrich sought Earhart for closure and peace, but Earhart acts as the turning point in the story. Instead of the struggles to trust that have marked the last few chapters, Earhart is proof that people can change, and Ulbrich is the one who made him change. Much like Tressa, Ulbrich learns a lot from the other travelers. Despite being the oldest and seemingly the wisest, Ulbrich struggles to understand himself because of his lack of purpose. Ulbrich has a lot to learn from the more emotional travelers since he's not all that in tune with what he needs on a personal level. That makes the Earhart change all the more noticeable. Earhart is a mirror to Ulbrich and everything that he could have become but did not because he had the other travelers there to pull him out of despair. Ulbrich's introspection is what makes him so interesting, and his dialogue with Earhart helps to bring all of that to life. Ulbrich's story changed very little from the base game to this adaptation, but he still learns a lot from this medium. By giving Ulbrich the chance to sit with his thoughts in every location, we can see his development in a way the game simply does not allow for. His relationship with Earhart accentuates that, and Ulbrich ends up as proof that people can change because he changed Earhart. He didn't think he could ever pull himself out of despair, but he shows otherwise when given the chance, and it all comes down to his realizations about himself over the course of the story. Ulbrich may not talk as much as some of the other travelers, but what he doesn't say is just as important, and I would say that it drives his story just as much. Ulbrich is not a man of words. He is a man of actions, and whether that be through helping Cobblestone, fighting in the arena, dueling Earhart, or slaying Werner, that remains true to the end. Primrose was a character that kind of wrote herself and dragged me along for the ride. There are a lot of jokes online about characters wanting to write themselves and breaking out of the plan you had established for them, and all of those jokes are absolutely correct. Primrose's Chapter 2 was the first one I wrote, and it unfolded in a way I didn't originally intend, but wound up being perfect for her. Primrose kind of led me down the path I wound up taking for her, and I really like how it turned out. Primrose's entire journey is one of revenge, but it's all underlined with this idea that she doesn't want to actually let revenge fuel her. It's all she knows, but she doesn't necessarily want that to be all she knows. She's a very different character in travel banter, often flirting and playfully teasing the other travelers. In her story chapters, though, she's dark and jaded. That contrast wound up really drawing Primrose's character out for me. How do these two sides of her exist together? How do they interact with the world? By the end of her Chapter 2, Primrose as the character had told me something the source material really didn't elaborate on. She didn't necessarily want revenge, but since it was all she knew how to hope for anymore, she followed it to the end. That wound up fueling a lot of the changes she underwent in this novelization. Primrose is a much darker character here than in the game because she kind of needs to be. The two sides of her are very interesting and contrasted one another well, but at the same time, it didn't quite make sense given the story I was trying to tell. She was very open and playful with her banters in Still Snow, but with how I had her set up as a character, that didn't work very well. It took Primrose a lot longer to come into her own here than in the game because of the development that couldn't be chalked up to suspension of belief or something that happened off screen. I needed to focus on it here, and to do that, I let Primrose control the narrative first and followed her along for the ride. All of that sounds really cryptic and vague, but it's really the best way I can put it. With all of these characters, I got into their heads on a very intimate level over the course of this story, but Primrose was the first one who truly required deep analysis like this. Her two faces could coexist, but they needed development before that could happen. In the end, those two faces wound up following the path of her internal struggle. She wants to be open with her friends and smile and laugh with them. On the other hand, she thinks of herself as nothing but a blade for Jeffrey's ghost. In order to be happy, she needs to work through the dehumanization she has endured and enforced upon herself. Primrose is at her happiest when she's not thinking about revenge. She smiles most in Victor's Hollow when she's gotten distance from Still Snow and isn't thinking about Noblecourt. The off-screen development in the game is very much on-screen here, and it shows her where she's at her best. I think that all comes to a head with her return trip to Noblecourt. Primrose is there because she wants to forget about Miguel and is continuing down her sunk cost fallacy revenge trip. She thinks that's all she's good for, and yet she only truly finds peace when she finds another reason to stand up again. She defeats Simeon in part to avenge Jeffrey, but it's also about avenging her past self, and that adds a new layer to the encounter in Everhold. Primrose's journey is, at its core, one about learning to love herself and find humanity in her own reflections. The other travelers are the perfect way for her to do that. And speaking of the other travelers, I think it's impossible to talk about Primrose as a character without discussing her relationship to love. This isn't even just about Honnet, even though Honnet is a large part of that. Primrose has a complex relationship with love because of the people she has encountered in her life. She thought of Simeon as the love of her life, but he groomed and betrayed her. She endured Jeffrey, but he was not there for her the way he should have been. Primrose needs to learn to see the truth and to find a way to love despite that. Our journey for revenge is one of hatred, but Primrose finds peace through her love. She is happiest with the travelers and practically proposes to Honnet when confessing her love. At the end of the day, Primrose needed love that she did not give to herself nor let herself receive during her 10 years of plotting vengeance. That love allows her to drop her jaded mask and finally be happy and free with the travelers, and it's truly beautiful. Sometimes, love really is all you need. In both the game and this story, the real star of the show in Alphen's story is his Chapter 3. His chapters are all strong for their own reasons, but his Chapter 3 is easily the best because of the implications it has on his character. On top of that, there's a lot of value to be found from analyzing Alphen's choices in the chapter in tandem with his connection with the rest of the travelers. It's an impactful moment, but there's a lot of extra weight that can be placed on that moment under the right circumstances. This story gave me one thing the game was unable to do: the chance to let the weight of Alphen's Chapter 3 hang in the air. The game has to account for you playing the chapters in any order, and as such, there's not really a way for Alphen's Chapter 3 to have a profound impact on the rest of the cast and their stories. Here, Alphen's third chapter is the turning point in the Chapter 3s. It's a heavy moment that needed to happen, but it can be felt for ages after the fact. Alphen's choice to kill Miguel is given a lot more time to breathe here because of the medium, and in my eyes, it's one thing that makes Alphen benefit massively from this story's format. The game didn't really have the chance to let this sit, but 8 Intertwined does, and I think it changes his characterization a lot. This also gave me the chance to set up great parallels for both for and with Alphen. Miguel's death parallels Ophelia killing Morlock to save Alphen back in Quarrycrest, another event specific to this retelling. On top of that, Alphen gets to draw connections between Miguel and the other members of the party who have killed and taken lives. I love the moral dilemma around Miguel in the game, but I feel like it truly shines here because of how much space and weight I can give it. Alphen's Chapter 3 isn't just a significant event for him. It changes the course of the entire story, and it sets everyone up for a notable arc in the back half of the Chapter 3s. Since I had so much more time to play with Alphen here, I was truly able to lean into the question about death and playing God with another person's life. The choice extends far beyond Alphen's Chapter 3 and 4. It can be felt in every conversation he has. Alphen knows realistically that some people need to die, and he has met many of them over the course of the story. In fact, he even jumps to believing death may be necessary with Vanessa back in his Chapter 2. He ultimately spares her, but he still considered it, and that thought, no matter how brief it is, needs to be given the time to sit. Here, it finds a parallel with Alphen's resentment of Darius. Alphen and Therion's relationship is a crucial part of both of their characters in the Chapter 3s and 4s, not just because of their romance, but also because of how naturally they come to one another as foils. I waited for a long time to establish the romantic relationships between various members of the cast, and I did so for a reason. I wanted them to stand on their own 2 feet before I introduced romance into the equation. Still, Alphen and Therion develop a lot once they are given the chance to lean on one another because of how perfectly they act as foils, even down to their thoughts on life and death. Their relationship is key to them both, and I love how it turned out. Alphen's arc as a whole is very focused on morality and what he believes to be ethical. I think it has a lot more space to thrive in this story because of the medium and the fact that Alphen can draw lines between the rest of the travelers and the people he encounters. He's not just weighing if murder is justifiable. He's considering the choices of people like Primrose, Cyrus, and Ophelia who have taken other lives leading up to Miguel's downfall. Alphen grew up in a small town and he doesn't know what he thinks about the world outside of it. His journey to find the truth is rough and long, but he gets there in the end, and he finds a choice he can be happy with. I also want to emphasize that the final resolution Alphen decides on isn't perfect. He's contradictory like all people, and while he is against murder, he still stands with killers. He still wants to kill Darius for what he did to Therion. Alphen decides to do what he thinks is best, even though he knows he's flawed. The best he can do is his best, and I think it's a great ending to his arc. He can't save everyone, but he wants to do what he can. He can't save the entire world, but he's going to try however he can. I love that Alphen's final choice isn't perfect or straightforward, and I think it adds a lot to his characterization. Being given the time to truly sit with his choices goes a long way for him, and I love the way this version of Alphen turned out. A bit of space with his Chapter 3 really helped it to shine even brighter. Alphen is one of the emotional hearts of the team, and a change in his mindset changes the entire cast's course throughout the Chapter 3s. He's a supportive friend to the end, and when he finally extends the same kindness to himself, he truly thrives and proves himself worthy of the title of Apothecary. I'm running out of water. Oh no. Therion is a bit of an interesting case in Eight Intertwined. I personally think he's the character who was changed the most in the jump between the game and the novelization. In the base game, you could very easily brush off his apathy and unwillingness to travel with anyone else as a matter of gameplay and story separation. Here, however, I needed a really good reason to justify him coming along with the rest of the group, and that was easily the hardest thing for me to figure out for him. In all honesty, Therion doesn't want to be here. He never has, and he acts like he never will. It takes Cordelia going behind his back to make a deal with the other travelers for him to go along with it. And even then, he spends a long time not being happy about it. Therion wanting to be on his own is a massive problem in a story that focuses on filling in the gaps of character interactions left vacant in the game. How am I supposed to iron out an arc for him when he's fighting me every step of the way? In order to make this change work, I had to give Therion a lot more focus than most of the other characters. He needed a reason to stick around, and to get him to a place where he was comfortable traveling with the others, I had to do a lot of hard work and thinking ahead. Therion is one of the characters I struggled with the most when writing because it was hard to wrangle him under control and keep him with the rest of the cast. What reason would he have to stay? Honestly, nothing at the beginning. Working around that was easily the hardest part of writing his interactions out. In the end, I found peace by giving Therion a connection first to Primrose and then using it as a jumping off point to the rest of the travelers. Primrose is the other character with the least reason to stick around with the others in the group, so I thought they could help walk their bad habits back until they were able to go along with the plan I had in mind. I think it worked like a charm, and it gave me the perfect opportunity to focus on a dynamic that I think gets overlooked in fandom content. I love Primrose and Therion's interactions here, and they really came a long way over the course of the story. Once I got the ball rolling with Therion, the pieces fell into place fairly easily. He's easily one of the characters who has changed the most in the jump between mediums, and in my eyes, he is number one. I think a lot of that comes down to making him a lot more introspective. Years on the road would come with Therion learning the ins and outs of his own mind. He doesn't have the tool to address those problems necessarily, but he still knows himself very well because of his occupation. He needs to know himself in order to trick others. I think that introspection made it a lot easier for him to then settle in with the rest of the travelers. One of my favorite parts of Therion's arc was in the midst of the Chapter 3s. Going into this story, I already had a plan in mind that Therion and Darius had once been in a toxic relationship, and I really got to go all in on that in the Chapter 3s. There's no way Therion could face Miguel and not end up intensely triggered by how similar Miguel and Darius are. The expansion of the story here gave me the chance to explore that in full, and it gave Therion a great arc that really sits at the center of the betrayal spiral the travelers go through in the Chapter 3s. Therion falling apart is in many ways the first domino that starts a party-wide crash going into Noblecourt. Therion really benefits from this medium because of how much it lets me hammer home the point of his story. No matter how many times you end up hurt or betrayed, trusting people is always worth it in the end. I feel like that holds a lot more weight when Therion has spent about 200 chapters up to that point getting to know the travelers and finding a home with them. Cordelia and Heathcote are fine, of course, but there's something about Therion's story that just lends itself so perfectly to having the other travelers involved. The fact of the matter is that on his own, Therion is a pretty static person. He knows his own mind well, and up until the story started, he was using that knowledge to outright ignore what he needed to do for his own sake. He couldn't move on from Darius because he was too busy shutting his feelings out to see how much they were hurting him. Therion needs someone to pull him out of his shell and show him that life is worth living after everything he's been through. I appreciated the message of Therion's story in game, but it was hard for me to really believe his speech to Darius in his final chapter when he spent the bulk of it on his own stealing the Dragonstones. Cordelia and Heathcote are in every chapter, but they're nowhere near as impactful as the other travelers could be, and by emphasizing Therion's dynamic with the other characters, he thrives as a character in the way the game never let him. I didn't realize how different my interpretation of Therion was from the game until I went to replay Octopath 1 about 2 years ago. I struggled to get through Therion's Chapter 1 because I got so used to my interpretation of him that I could barely get through his dialogue in the game. Therion is a character I got used to analyzing as deeply as I could to justify his continued presence and activity in the group, and since the game didn't need to do any of that due to gameplay story separation, it was a bit of a shock to me. Still, I absolutely love how his story turned out, and I think Therion capitalized off the novelization medium in a way few others could. I adore him, and this story really helped me to bring my personal thoughts on Therion's potential to life in a way the game never really had the opportunity to. It took a lot of headcanons and analysis to get here, but I'm beyond proud of how it came together in the end. Going into this story, I was terrified of writing for H'aanit. She's my second favorite character in the game, and I love her to bits, but I had no idea what to do with her dialogue. There was no real consistency of her Old English dialogue, and I didn't know how to adapt it without butchering it. In the end, I came up with a pattern for her dialogue by studying her Chapter 1, and I went with that for the rest of the story. Sometimes it contradicted the dialogue the game presented to me, but I didn't really mind that. If that was the price I had to pay in order to make her dialogue as simple to write as possible, then so be it. Even though I was terrified of writing H'aanit's dialogue, I think she turned out really well. Ironically, she speaks the least out of the travelers by a lot. This is partially because she's the last traveler of the 8 to be introduced, but it also comes down to the kind of character she is. H'aanit is quiet and introspective, and she often expresses herself best with Lind or in her internal monologue. In my eyes, this is reflective of her sheltered history, too. She grew up in the forests of Swarky, and she didn't have much contact with the outside world. H'aanit has a rich internal world because she knows so little of the external world. She struggles a lot with communicating and finding her footing once she leaves Swarky, since she never really imagined she would have to leave this way. H'aanit adapts the best way she can, but at the end of the day, she is a woman of routine, and all of this has thrown a massive wrench in her plans. One of the most interesting things about H'aanit here is that you can't really take her thoughts on herself at face value. She claims to understand very little about the world around her and the people who live in it, but in truth, H'aanit knows more about people than she claims. H'aanit finds people to be difficult to understand, and she struggles a lot during the string of betrayals in Chapter 3s. She doesn't know why people would hurt others so carelessly, and she struggles to properly articulate herself in a way that she thinks will help her. Much like Cyrus, Alphen, and Tressa, H'aanit is being exposed to the world at large for essentially the first time. She's new to this, and she doesn't know how to keep up with it. Despite this, H'aanit understands people in a way that goes beyond words. In fact, I would argue that her down-to-earth and solemn nature help her to understand people better than most of her peers at times. She doesn't know how to put it into words, but she still understands those she meets deep down. This is what I mean when I say H'aanit's thoughts on herself and the world can't be taken exactly at face value. She knows more than she acts like she does, and she doesn't seem to realize just how deep her comprehension runs. H'aanit starting to feel her way through her emotions is an important part of her arc. Prior to the story, she never thought of Zonta as her father. He was the one who raised her, yes, but H'aanit didn't recognize just how deeply she cared for him until he was gone. H'aanit was very out of tune with her emotions before she was forced to interact with highly emotional people that she set out on her journey with, and they showed her what it meant to try and dig into her own feelings. H'aanit coming to think of Zonta as a father is just the beginning, and it sets her down the path of truly understanding herself through her relationships with others. Even though H'aanit is the least talkative of the cast, she grows most when she is with others. She spends time alone to think through her worries, but she is at her best when she is surrounded by her friends. H'aanit has a quiet understanding of her companions, and it fuels her development to the end. They can walk her through everything she never truly let herself feel before she met them. H'aanit was used to the emotional dramatics of Zonta, but she never really gave herself the chance to express herself in the same ways. It is through her friends that H'aanit comes to learn more about herself and then the rest of the world around her. Even when her journey grows difficult, H'aanit's unwavering faith in her friends gives her something to latch onto and guide herself with. She may be the quietest, but she has a lot to express in that silence, and H'aanit only finds peace with the rest of her friends. Near the end of the story, H'aanit is much more open with her feelings than she was starting out. In some cases, this is positive, such as with her blossoming love with Primrose or her reunion with Zonta. In other cases, this leads her into a spiral like the aftermath of realizing Red Eye was human. Still, H'aanit comes back to her senses, and thanks to her connections with her friends. Regardless of the drawbacks, though, H'aanit connecting with her emotions is undoubtedly positive, and she finishes the story as a quiet beacon of hope for her friends. She never would have made it this far without them, and despite her reserved silence, she is not a loner. Haunted thrives off her connections with others, even if it is just sitting with them in silence. Alright, character section's done. Let's talk about the post-game. Even before the second Octopath game came out, I knew I wanted to do something a bit more with the post-game than the game did. As much as I enjoy the final few quests of Octopath 1, it feels a bit disjointed and random when compared to the rest of the story. You're probably not going to stumble into the post-game unless you're actively looking for it, and justifying that random chance in the narrative felt like a massive task. I decided I wanted to do something more, and that was how we wound up with the final arc. Throughout development, I called it the side quest rush. Since the arc would be kind of dry if it was just investigating anything that could have led back to the Gate of Finis, I threw in side quests to make things more interesting. This also allowed me to wrap up arcs for the important characters who made the journey possible over the course of the story. It felt like the perfect way to wrap everything up. It's not quite Journey of Further Dawn like an Octopath 2, but I still really like how it turned out. This was definitely the part of the story where I had the most creative freedom, since I needed to do various things in order to make it happen narratively. I needed to give a reason for all these things to happen, since it wouldn't have been enough for it to just happen on its own. This isn't a game, and we're not players looking through a guide to figure out these side quests. We're readers here, and we need to address this story in terms of a novelization instead of just a game. I took it in the direction of it being a massive investigation with a few cameos from past characters sprinkled in. As for how I chose the side quest, I looked at the main ones that included characters who appear in the main story. Octopath 1 has a lot of side quests, and I knew I wouldn't be able to include all 101 of them in this story and still maintain the pacing. The cast would have wound up super bloated, and I just couldn't do it. After narrowing my scope to just side quests with characters from the main plot, it was a matter of quality control. I cut out the side quests that felt silly or unnecessary, and I gave appropriate narrative weight to the side quests that I kept in. I had to change quite a few of them in order to make them work with the story being set up here, but I think it was a perfect chance for the end of a bunch of character arcs. It all came together very well in the end, even if it was an absolute pain in the neck to plan. All's well that ends well, right? I added in some more content in the Gate of Finis too, and that came in the form of the 5 journal entries I added. There were some that felt like they just belonged in the game but didn't end up being included, so I wrote them in. Others needed to be there to fill the gaps from this novelization and its differences from canon. I wanted there to be 13 journal entries to correspond with the 13 gods, though, so we wound up with extra entries from Simeon, Alfred, Esmeralda, Yvonne, and LeBlanc. I think it helped to keep the Gate of Finis feeling fresh, since the game was very much a rinse and repeat of fighting a boss and reading a journal entry. I couldn't really fix the foundational issues with the lore dumps in the Gate of Finis, but I did what I could to keep things interesting where possible. I also think it tightens up the narrative a little bit by giving more information and context to everything happening. I used a little bit of mobile lore in the postgame too, something I absolutely didn't see coming. I wasn't planning on being compliant with Champions of the Continent at all, for reasons I explained earlier, but in the end, that turned into cherry-picking what I wanted specifically for the end of the game. That all started and ended with a few world-building details in the Isle of Orsa, but it's still there. I meant what I said about not being loyal to the mobile game and its lore, and I added in a little bit while ignoring the vast majority of it. Champions of the Continent was not entirely forgotten, even if I did very little with it. I feel like the largest elephant in the room here is how long the chapters in the postgame got to be. I wanted to cap off this story at 250 chapters since that number felt nice and clean to me, but I knew that I was going to need to put a lot in the last arc in order to make it all fit. The chapters started getting longer when it was necessary, and the last 5 are particularly long. And yeah, they're massive. The first part of Caldera's fight is twice as long as most other chapters. I wanted to end it at 250 chapters, but I didn't want to cheat anyone out of content by cutting corners either. That's why chapters started to get longer at the Gate of Finis. It felt wrong to make the chapters shorter by including the journal entries and the word tally, so I just made them all longer, and that helped us to get closer to the monstrously long word count at the end of the story. Overall, I had a lot of fun adapting the postgame. I had to improvise and flesh out the finale from the game in a new way, and I think it helped to keep things interesting. There's a lot of intriguing stuff here, and I'm proud of how it turned out. This story really goes out on a high note, and I'm glad I was able to throw in all of this extra content to make the ending as great as possible. I don't think I can emphasize enough just how important this story is to me. I meant every word about it here, and I could say thousands more if I was given the time or the prompt. Intertwined has absolutely changed the way I write my stories, but also the way I view the world around me. This story was there for me when I otherwise felt alone. It has been a constant in my life through the greatest highs and the darkest lows of the last 3.5 years. It doesn't feel real now that it's over, honestly. I still can't believe it's finished after all this time. And I especially can't believe the reception it has gotten. This story would not exist without the support of every person who gave the story kudos or left a comment. Your encouragement helped me to bring this from just a pipe dream into something I could truly adore. It Intertwined is a story about connection, and I can only hope it has brought all of you a new avenue of connection too. If it means even a little bit to someone else, then this has all been worth it. I would love to hear from any of you how you feel about this story or what it means to you. Perhaps that's a bit self-indulgent to ask, but I still wanted to say it. Comments and feedback really are fuel for me as a writer, and I love to hear from everyone who reads my work. I hope this story has made you happy, and I hope it continues to bring you joy in the years to come, now that it has been completed. Whew. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you so much for making it this far. If you're hearing this, your support really means the world to me and has brought me this far into Intertwined. Thank you for everything. May the road ahead treat you well. Every path is yours to take. And that brings an end to the stuff I had written for the official retrospective, so I'll be going on to questions next. These are questions I received from readers of the story since I opened a form for them a while ago through a link on the AO3 page. If you want to stick around for the Q&A, then be my guest. There are a lot of questions coming, so buckle up, everyone. Drinking water. Okay, first question from Nico. Talk about Cyrus. I already talked about Cyrus pretty extensively in his section, but I'll talk about him a bit more here. I really like the way he turned out. I know my interpretation of him is very different from what the game has happening with him, but I love it. I loved analyzing him over the course of the story through both the lens of his rational and emotional choices. Cyrus is a very logical person, and I think he becomes a lot more interesting when he has to face emotions instead of just rationality. The story puts him in a very emotional spot, and I think it brings out both the best and worst in him. He ultimately ends in a stronger position than where he began, and I think learning to balance both emotion and logic is a crucial part of that. I love Cyrus to bits. He is the #1 traveler in my heart. Pretty much every question here from here on out is from Tales of Awesome. What spurred you to pick Ophelia as the protagonist? Granted, everyone is to some extent, but Ophelia is the person who comes up the most, and the story starts with her. The others even mark her as a leader. The main reason is that Ophelia is the first character in the Octopath acronym. The other character I was considering starting with was Tressa, because she's the thematic final traveler, but it felt wrong to pick up in the middle of the acronym, especially since I would be picking up people in the order of the acronym, just in the middle. I cannot word right now. Ophelia kind of grew into a leader the more I wrote her. The characters really came to life over the course of the story, and Ophelia falling into a leadership position was something that happened naturally without me pushing for it. Ophelia just turned out the way she did with the right writing, and though the story felt like it was pushing me though the story felt like it was pushing her in that direction instead of me being the one doing the pushing. So the short answer is because she starts the acronym, and she became a leader later on because that was what the brain rot told me to write. What was your process for deciding which side quests would get added to the story? Octopath 1 has a lot of side quests. It has too many side quests. 101 side quests. That was too much for me to adapt without it breaking the pacing completely, so I decided to narrow the scope a little bit. I restricted it to only main characters who show up in the main story and have a notable impact on it. So, in other words, it was only the Gate of Finis and next chapter side quests. From there, I did a quality check and thought through which side quests I was interested in including. Some of them I just didn't like, such as the Mick and Max side quest about a fake Leon, and others introduced a new character for a single side quest in a cast that was large enough without it, such as Heathcote's side quest. So in short, I cut it down to side quests with characters that appear in the main story, and then conduct quality control to see what would make it to the final draft. What motivated the changes to Quarry Crest and Alphen's Gold Shore? Though the entire story has several moments that stand out, Quarry Crest is probably the moment on most people's minds, given how it affects Ophelia's development and starts the more pessimistic arcs in the story. It was mostly because I wanted to make more of the cast feel more involved with the narrative. I couldn't put all of the travelers at center stage during another character's chapter, but there were smaller things I could do to change things up from the game. With Gold Shore, it was mostly about wanting to incorporate the various ideologies of the other travelers and bringing that all together into something cohesive. In Quarry Crest's case, I wanted to take a chapter that doesn't do much for the overarching narrative, Tressa's Chapter 2, and add something more to it. It was a perfect chance to capitalize on the supplemental material about Creek and finally establish it in the narrative. So in short, I wanted to lean into the premise of this story of having the other travelers more involved with everything, and that manifested in chapters like Tressa's second chapter that are very different from the source material. What made you pick out each pairing? Do you personally like how you had the romances play out? The idea of this story was very self-indulgent from the start, and I immediately decided that I wanted to cater to what I specifically wanted to read and write, rather than following the ideas of other people. As a result, the pairings I chose are just the ones I like best. I really like how they all play out too. I think making them slow burn was the right call, since the relationship teasing doesn't really come up until the chapter 3s, and most pairings don't get together until the chapter 4s. I think that avoids a common pitfall of stories like this where characters start to become impossible to separate from their pairing. I wanted to establish everyone as a character individually before I leaned into any romance. I'm very happy with how it turned out in the end, though, and I feel like the romance is a great starting point for intriguing character development while not completely overtaking the rest of the story. Water break. Octopath Traveler runs the gamut of emotions across the board. Ironically, Octopath Traveler 2 seems to be more optimistic despite having less optimistic characters. 3 to the first game's 5. I wonder if you know which one I'm talking about. But Octopath Traveler seems to divide the cynical and idealistic sections fairly evenly. What was the motivating factor for focusing more on the cynical aspects for 8 Intertwined? I'm going to assume that the pessimists you're thinking about in Octopath 1 are Ulbrich, Therion, and Primrose. Anyway, the motivating factor was just kind of how the story played out. I went into 8 Intertwined without planning all that much about what I was going to do, or with the characters or the story. I had an order and a roadmap, but aside from that, I wanted to let the story guide itself. I followed my gut and trusted my heart with a lot of these plot points, and in the end, it took us down a cynical route. I feel like it's also just a realistic byproduct of having the entire cast involved with everything going on. The chapter 3s have a common theme of betrayal, so that was naturally going to get a focus if everyone else was getting involved. So I don't know if I really had a motivation here as much as it was just how the pieces of everything fell. I let the story take me where it wanted to be taken, and it wound up being a darker path than the game, all on its own. How do you feel you did in capturing Primrose? Her banters in the game are universally gadfly and playful in nature, and Primrose is rather chipper in conversation with others. Here, that's mostly relegated to talking with Therion and Victor's Hollow. I personally think you made the right choice focusing on the darker parts of her characterization, but what motivated that? The answer is very similar to the previous one. It felt like a natural consequence of the storytelling structure. Primrose is very talkative and loves to tease people, but it didn't feel right to lean into that when she was grieving in Still Snow or coping very poorly in Noble Court. Primrose still has her shining moments of being playful and flirty here and there, but it didn't feel right for her to tease the travelers right off the bat because of her grief over Yusufa and her initial distrust of the party. Primrose got there eventually, but it took time. I know this interpretation of Primrose is different from what a lot of other stories go for with her, but I think it fits the story 8 Intertwined is trying to tell. Primrose is a darker character because the story called for it. I let the story take me where it wanted to go, and it took Primrose down this different path, so I went with it. Speaking of Therion, why is Therion so much more introspective here? The only time anxiety really got to him was in his chapter 3 in the base game. This was because I thought that if Therion was alone for years on end, he would have to get used to just sitting with his own thoughts. Therion being a lone thief means that he's got a lot of time to think through everything that happens to him, and he needs to be a schemer in order to pull off his heists. Also, you're probably tired of hearing this, but it was just the direction the story took me in. Therion as a character was one that needed to be broken down, so I took every opportunity I could to get into his head. I had to analyze him deeply in order to get him on the same page as the rest of the travelers, and that led to him becoming very aware of himself. Therion is a lot more introspective because I felt that just made sense with his character, especially with how he's been shown to fall easily into flashbacks in the game in his chapters 1 and 2. He's got a much greater sense of self and knowledge of his emotional bandwidth here, and I think it's just because he was alone for so long. It comes with the territory. How did you come up with each traveler's most precious treasure? This is a good one. It was mostly about just getting in each character's head. Since it was something I had been doing throughout the story, it came to me pretty easily once I started thinking about it. Every character's journey goal tells you a lot about what they want or what they value, and figuring out if you want to lean into that or go against it is at the core of figuring out their treasures. Ophelia values family most, so her treasure, the hill, represents that connection. Sarah's values knowledge, so his treasure is about passing knowledge down to a new generation. Ulbrich's treasure is what he decided to be his purpose at the end of his journey for redemption, his blade to fight for others. Primrose values the past, but finds something beyond it in treasuring her faith in the future. Jeffrey's dagger. Alfin loves people and treasures wanting to help them most, so he gets Zeph's satchel. Therion's journey is one about freedom, but in the end, the Fool's Bangle isn't really as much of a chain as the story sets it up as. Instead, it's about the freedom to choose and the freedom to trust, and his is one of my favorite treasures because of it. The Fool's Bangle is the reason he started to open up to the other characters, because at the time he thought he had no choice, but then later on, it was something he was choosing to do. Honnet learns throughout her journey that she values family most of all, so her parents' rings. Tressa is much the same, and her treasure fits in perfectly with all the others of her journal and her journey. So in short, I just thought about what they would value most and went from there, and it all came pretty naturally, honestly. I feel like this question gets asked a lot, but if you had to change any part of the story, which would it be, and how, and why? I don't really have an answer to this one for the most part, because I got most of my changes out there when I wrote this story. Everything I wanted to change about the story of the game wound up being changed here. There's one thing I wish could have played out differently, though. Alphen's Chapter 3 and 4. I really wish they could have been closer together, but due to scheduling conflicts, they had to be pretty far apart. I needed Alphen 3 to happen near the middle of the Chapter 3s, and I wanted his Chapter 4 to be at the end, along with the other Graham chapters. Especially because Tressa's was always going to be last. I was planning on having Alphen be mopey and down from his Chapter 3 to his Chapter 4, but that didn't end up working because it would require him to be upset for upwards of 75 chapters. Instead, he got a small resolution in Wellspring and found his true answer in Orwell. There's not really much to be done about it, but I think that was the biggest thing I was disappointed about in terms of the timeline for this retelling. What would you say is the overall message you hope to convey? I went pretty in depth into the purpose behind this story during the first section of this retrospective, but the message I was trying to get across was about the importance of human connection. This story got me through a lot of really tough times, and its emphasis on friendship is no coincidence. The main message I would say is that you can change the lives of others just as they can change yours. Friendship is a powerful thing that can change everything if you just give it the chance. People change people. God, I love this story. This one's 3 questions, each related to each other and probably requiring some retrospection on your work. For each group of chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, which story was your favorite to adapt? For Chapter 1, Primrose. The Chapter 1s were hard to decide on here because they're all so simple in comparison to what comes after, but I like the changes I made to Primrose's first chapter with marking Yusufa's grave. It's not too special because it's an introduction, but Primrose takes the crown here. For Chapter 2, say it with me now, Tressa! I've sung Corey Crest praises before, but Tressa's Chapter 2 felt like the first time I really broke the conventions of canon, and I had a really fun time doing it. Corey Crest will always have a special place in my heart because of this. For the Chapter 3s, Therion. I went back and forth between him, Primrose, and Alphen as the answer for this for a while before I remembered something. I was hooked on writing Therion's chapter when I started working on it, and I cranked out the entire chapter in record time because I couldn't stop thinking about it. All 4 of the dialogue-focused chapters were written in the span of a week, which is 20,000 words. I would write an entire chapter and then some in a day because I loved it so much. Therion's Chapter 3 was the start of the travelers moving toward the end of their journeys, and it was a perfect resolution to everything that had been building since Cyrus's Chapter 3 ages before. The improvement of the characters from their previous paranoia really sells this one for me. And for Chapter 4, Tressa again. I went into this knowing what I was going to do with Tressa's finale, and it was one thing I planned out very far in advance. Coincidentally, it's also the final chapter that changed the most. I guess that's just a thing with me and Tressa. But I feel like this chapter, much like Tressa herself, just captures the spirit of Octopath Traveler. It's perfect to me. For each group of chapters, which villain or monster was your favorite to write for, with any criteria such as I enjoyed writing out the fight, or I felt this monster was appropriately established as threatening for the purposes of the narrative. Chapter 1, Helganish, because I loved seeing this guy die. He's a Chapter 1 antagonist with the best setup, and it's very sweet to see him crumble. Chapter 2, Morlock. Yep, okay. I'll spare you the Corey Crest rambling again, but I really did like what I did with Morlock. I guess you can share the spot with Omar, but Morlock is the one who I really leaned into here with his connection with Ophelia, and the change of him being the one who sent Ollie's father into bankruptcy. It was just a great time all around. Chapter 3's. This one is tough. I have a handful of answers here, but the short one is Miguel. Because come on, it's Miguel. He's a bastard and he knows it. He's a great villain, and writing his downfall was so satisfying. I want to give honorable mentions to Albus and Gareth, though, because I really like the changes I implemented for them. It's different from the game, but I love what I did with both of them. Lastly, I want to give an honorable mention to Lucia. She's not a Chapter 3 boss, though, so I don't think she counts. Writing her stalking the Travelers was fun, though. So the actual answer is Miguel, but I really like what I did with Albus, Gareth, and Lucia too. I got ahead of myself, but chapter 4 was Simeon. This guy needs no introduction, but I loved writing his one-on-one content with Primrose. I hate him with every fiber of my being, but he's a great villain and a perfect antagonist to push Primrose to her limits. I hate how much I enjoy writing him. Why else do you think he got an extra journal entry in the Key to Finish that wasn't in the game? I hate him, but he's fun to write. Lastly, which NPC guest star was your favorite to write for each group of chapters? Chapter 1, Leon. I just think he's cool. I have a lot of fun whenever he's around, but he's at his best in my eyes in Tressa's Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Odette. I really need to stop talking about Gory Crest, but I love Odette's expanded role with Primrose here. I wish the two of them actually talked in the game, because it would be everything to me. Chapter 3, Earhart. Again, I really like his expanded role and interactions with Primrose and Cyrus specifically, and Ulbrich, obviously. Earhart is an amazing character, and I love being able to write him no matter the circumstances. And for Chapter 4, Liana. I loved writing her interactions with Ophelia a lot more than I expected to, and I love how everything turned out even more. She's just a lot of fun and a perfect foil for Ophelia, both at this point in the story and the end of Ophelia's character arc. Okay, drink break. I'm having to ration my water right now. Oof, should have prepared for this better. Which traveler did you have the most difficult time writing for, and what exactly was difficult about writing them? There were 3 travelers that gave me trouble, and I discussed them all in their own sections, so I'll go over them briefly here. Ulbrich was hard because I was nervous I wasn't going to write him well. I was scared about interpreting him incorrectly and not selling his internal crisis. I grew to like writing him more as the story went on, but it took me a while to get to a place I was happy with because of how nervous I was. Going in, he was the character I was most afraid of writing. Therion was tough because I changed his in-game characterization so much. I can't even look at Therion's Chapter 1 in the base game anymore because it just doesn't even feel like the same character to me. Therion is one of the characters who gets the most attention because it felt like he was fighting me. I wanted him to open up to the travelers, but the matter of getting him there was a pain in the neck. I was worried about how I was going to make him stick around, even though Cordelia made a deal with the other party members. He hates people, and getting past that sucks, but he got a lot easier to write after Still Snow and Noble Court's first visits. Lastly, Hana was hard because of her dialect. I came up with the rules for it by the early Chapter 2s, though, and once I hit that point, it became a lot easier. She's still the hardest character for me to write quickly, but I'm a lot more comfortable with her now that I have rules to follow with her grammar. Is your focus unparalleled? Okay, but seriously, did you get more than you bargained for writing this? I think my focus is unparalleled after almost 4 years in a story that sits at over 1.25 million words. As for the actual question, yes, I definitely did. Back when I first started this, I thought every in-game chapter would equate to 4 chapters of story content. I lost track of that very quickly after hitting Primrose's Chapter 2, and at that point I decided to just let the story run its course and tell itself in how many chapters it needed. I did not expect it to be this long, nor did I expect it to receive so much positive attention. I'm very happy I wrote it, but wow, it was more of an undertaking originally than I thought it would be. If you had to choose a part of the story that you felt the game did better as a narrative, what would it be? The side quests, easily. I think the side quests in Octopath 1, excessive though they may be, do a great job of articulating the game's thesis. Everyone has a story to tell, and every road is yours to take. With this story, I couldn't do that without assassinating the pacing where it stood, and bloating the cast way too much. The game format definitely lends itself better to storytelling like that. The side quests are handled about as well as they can be in this story, but the game really hits it out of the park with its thesis statement and its connection to the side quests. Last question. What was your favorite moment of all to write? This is a tough one. There were a lot of moments I loved writing, but there's one that stands out to me as something that I was looking forward to for months before I got to it. I couldn't wait to write the culmination of Tressa's final chapter and the last bit of the main story. It was such a shining moment in my mind that I had envisioned for years before I reached that point. It's the moment most in the spirit of Octopath Traveler to me, and it was something I looked forward to for ages before finally getting there. I also really enjoyed working on chapter 249, which is the epilogue section where all the characters are off living their own lives after the end of the story. I wrote the entire 10,000 word chapter in 2 days because I loved it so much. And that brings the question section to an end. Thank you all again for reading and watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for seeing this story through to its end with me. One last time, this is Crescent Digital Dreams signing off, and I will see you in February of 2025 for the release of the Octopath 2 novelization, It Interwoven. Have a great day, everybody.